Hi there, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this APMG webinar today in partnership with House of PMO. My name is Mark Constable. I'll be your host and moderator for the session, and it's a pleasure to be joined by presenter Eileen Roden, who's a co-founder of House of PMO. Eileen lives and breathes PMO, so you're in great hands for today's session. Eileen and her business partner Lindsay Scott launched House of PMO and the PMO Competency Framework in 2021 with a vision of becoming the professional body for PMO professionals globally. Prior to that, they launched the PMO Flash Mob back in 2013 and the annual PMO conference in 2015, with both still going very strong today. In today's session, Eileen will be focusing on the role of a PMO Administrator, which in some organisations may be known as a Project Co-ordinator or Project Support Officer. Eileen will be focusing on the knowledge, skills and competencies required to perform effectively in the role, and also taking a look at the development opportunities available. Before I hand things over to Eileen, bear with me a few more moments while I cover a few logistics for the session. So the first thing to note is we are recording the session, and everyone that's registered will receive a follow-up email once we've got the recording available up online. So do look out for the follow-up email over the next couple of working days. Secondly, you have an opportunity to submit questions at any point during the session. I'll be keeping a close eye on those as we go. And towards the end, we'll make sure we leave a little bit of time to pose those questions to Eileen. And last but not least, we welcome any feedback. So that helps us with planning and delivering webinars in the future. So any feedback, positive and negative, very much welcome. And you'll have my email address from things like the reminder email. So yeah, fire any feedback to me. Okay, I think we're set. So without further ado, welcome Eileen. Great to have you with us again today, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much. So good, I think we're just about into afternoon. It's certainly here in the UK, so I think we've got people joining from a range of different countries, but certainly just turned in afternoon here in the UK. So as Mark said, my name's Eileen Roden. I have been in and around PMOs probably all my working life. I went into project management, but very quickly found my way into PMOs. And I always say I kind of ended up in a PMO and thought I'd died and gone into heaven, and couldn't understand why careers officers didn't tell everybody to start their career in a PMO, because it was certainly a great place. And some people leave the PMO. I've never managed to do that. So today I'm going to talk about that kind of entry-level role in the PMO Administrator. And we're just going to talk a little bit about the day-to-day job of the PMO Administrator, what that actually means, what you actually kind of do during the day. And then from that, we're going to talk about what knowledge, skills and behaviours will actually make you most effective in that role, and how we can what kind of areas we need to develop. Now, APMG have got a course that the House of PMO has set up, specifically designed to help people into that kind of entry level. So we'll talk a little bit about what that covers and how that helps you in your role. And then we'll talk about, well, where does it lead to? Where do we go after we if we take this big jump to go and work as a PMO Administrator and start working in kind of project land? What's the potential career path? And then finally, we'll just talk about, well, if we do want to make that jump, what's the next step? What can we do? So as Mark said, there's happy to answer any and all the questions that you've got. I don't necessarily see them as they come in, but Mark, if people are kind of saying things that are relevant at the time, happy that you jump in and we can deal with things as they come up on the screen. So in terms of why do PMO administrators exist? So the whole idea of a PMO Administrator is to support the project, the program or portfolio manager, or potentially anybody in their team in the administrative and secretarial aspects of their projects, programs or portfolios. So it really is a kind of that entry-level support role, which means it's open to almost anybody and everybody who is got some kind of administrative expertise, or even actually it's their kind of first job after university. It's a great entry-level role to go in and start to get embedded in projects, programs and portfolios. One of the interesting things is when we talk about kind of kind of administration, there's still a significant amount of administration jobs. And I know my mum, when she was working, she was a secretary, and this whole kind of concept of secretaries are probably no longer around, but there's certainly, in terms of administrative support around all aspects of the organisation, and this is the specific administration support in relation to projects and programs. So there are significant things that a whole range of things that we can do at this level. Generally, in terms of actually kind of getting into administrator role, is really this kind of basic understanding of project management. So we talk about administrators coming over and starting to work in a project environment, and it's really helpful if you've got that basic understanding of project management. So nobody expects you to go off and do your kind of a great big, a range of project management certification course. It's this generic understanding of, well, I've been doing it in the business for a while perhaps as an admin assistant, and I want to move over. What's going to be different when I start working on a project? How's that going to feel different? So that's potentially kind of what your entry level requirements are, with some knowledge of what's expected really of a project administrator or a project support officer position, which is of another role name that is given to this particular level of position. So let's have a look at kind of what a particular day might look like for somebody who's a PMO administrator. So these are the types of things that we would do. So first thing in the morning, we've got a steering committee meeting. And so we need to sort out the room booking and also fix the agenda. So again, that's kind of some of the standard administration stuff, knowing kind of where to get those room bookings, make sure everything's sorted for that, but actually fixing the agenda, understanding who needs to be informed what the agenda is, who needs to bring the relevant information for discussion, and potentially we may also be involved in terms of bringing some of that information for the meeting on Wednesday. Once we've got that sorted, we then go on to sorting out some documentation which has been produced and perhaps isn't formatted correctly. So we need to go and kind of do some proofreading of some documents and kind of make sure they're in the right format for submission for review. So again, it's about understanding the organisation structure in and around the project, who needs to have the reviews to make sure we can get them sent out, and then we'll be doing the chase up to make sure we get the feedback in the correct format for decisions to be made. After that, then we've got to sort out last week's time allocation. So we've got a number of people around the project. We've got some temporary staff who've come in and work for an agency. Part of our role is to make sure that we've got all of those timesheets in place. We've got to make sure that the project manager is happy that those timesheets are correct, that the people have actually worked the time they've said on the project, and we will pull together a utilisation report to have that conversation with the project or programme manager before we do the kind of the next stage in getting them posted and make sure the payments go through. So at 12 o'clock, well, rather than just kind of sit around and kind of have some lunch quietly, there's a lunch and learn session on. So again, typically as a project administrator, I've still got quite a bit to learn around what's happening around the project, or actually just around project management. So the project's got a lunch and learn session on, so I thought I'd go along to that at lunchtime. Still get a time for a little bit of break before this afternoon, and I'm going into a project status update meeting. And my role, I must remember to take the agendas, because I will also be involved in making sure that the minutes are all completed correctly, the actions are updated, and then I will also be kind of chasing up those after the meeting as well. So there's a couple of hours in the status update meeting this afternoon, and then at 4 o'clock I will do a kind of the first pass at the minute, so much easier to get them done as soon as I've come out of that meeting, and again do a final check again tomorrow morning before I give them back to the project manager to review before circulating to the attendees. then final thing this evening, just before I go, I shall catch up on my emails and do tomorrow's diary to find out what I've got tomorrow. And then in amongst all of that, I've got a couple of things that I just are on my to-do list to try and find in. So checking on the purchase order. So on the project, we've made some purchases for some. It might be for some stationery. It might well be for some steel and some other items that we need on the project. It's always interesting, depending on what kind of project you work on, the variety of different things that you end up purchasing. But I need to check the purchase orders to make sure they've approved, so our suppliers have been paid. There's a couple of updates to the timesheeting system. So a couple of people I know missed their inputs last week, so I need to make some changes to that. I've got access to the system and can make them make those changes. We've got an away day, a project away day in a couple of weeks' time, and it's remote, so I need to kind of make sure we've got all of the hotels and travel booked for that. And we've got a new kind of the stationery's run down, so I've got a stationery order to do as well. So one of the things, that I think if we look at the day of the PMO administrator, it's hugely varied. Yes, we get involved with a whole range of different people in and around the project. It's not just it really isn't just a PA to the project manager. It is about doing lots of other project type activity and supporting not just the project manager, but also the rest of their team. I get to see what's happening in and around the project. I get to know the people who are working on the project. I'm learning because I sit through some of those update meetings. I understand and certainly increasing my project management knowledge, and I get the opportunity to, like the lunch and learn sessions, go on a number of other learning not interventions, wrong, some learning events that help me understand the role around project and program management. So if we were to kind of summarize what the responsibilities were of a PMO administrator, it is about providing that kind of comprehensive administration service, which is a whole range of things in terms of kind of anything from kind of taking meetings, chasing actions, range and travel, and any kind of ad hoc queries around the project. So that could include, things like when's the next end date, when's the next testing cycle going to finish, when's the expected go live going to be, when do we need to have these documents in for the review meeting that's taken place at the end of the month. So we would be expected to know enough about what's happening in the project to answer those kind of straightforward queries. We are very likely to be the master of all things that are documented. So whether that be physical documentation, and it does, there are still a number of organisations who have physical documentation they need to look after. More and more, obviously, there's online documentation that is shared, particularly as we've all been working remotely, that is shared across the project team remotely, that we have to continue to manage. So making sure we've got the right versions available, making sure people have kind of read and updated the information kind of can sit within our role as well. Typically, it's the PMO administrator who would maintain the systems for things like recording costs, timesheets, purchases, expenses. So again, it's not necessarily all of our information, but we make sure they're available and that people are putting the right information in and very much kind of pulling off reports for that. So that could include anything from a status report from various members of the project team, as we've mentioned in the daily activities. It could be bringing up kind of what needs to be approved from timesheets, what's the latest kind of, how much have we spent against our budget, how much time have we got left on the project. As we've got access to those systems, we can pull off those bits of information as we get the requests through. So as I say, quite wide and varied. There are some very specific project management pieces of documentation that we may also get involved in. So risks, so typically a project will have a risk register that needs to be maintained and updated. And again, we're going to come on to the knowledge, skills and behaviours we need to have in order to be able to do some of these. But in order to be able to maintain the risk register, having an understanding of risk management in a project context is obviously helpful and preferred. Actions, issues, change and dependency registers. So these are typically the registers that we would be expected to maintain, and this is where we probably going to need some project management knowledge to help us understand what kind of information needs to be in these registers, so we don't just kind of type in anything or kind of maintain them based on what anybody says. We can question and just make sure we have the information that we actually need. So in order to do this role well, and part of what the House of PMO has developed and released last year is the competency framework. So what this says is to do each of the PMO roles, and we're going to talk specifically about the PMO Administrator. These are the key knowledge, skills and behaviours required that underpin the core role that you perform and make you a better PMO Administrator. So let's have a look at knowledge to start with. So we've pulled out 7 key areas of knowledge that you will need to be an effective PMO administrator. And I do want to point out that actually when we look at some of these, we recognise that actually we can bring this knowledge from many other roles that we may have been involved in the organisation already, or actually can bring in from another organisation. So these are not all specific to kind of understanding about project and programme management. This is where we said there's a lot of transferable skills that actually makes the PMO administrator a really good entry-level role into projects and programmes. So just to kind of go through these quickly, just to kind of talk about them in a little bit more detail. There is an expectation that you'll know the application and tools of the organisation. Now, that kind of standard kind of email, obviously the Microsoft tools, Word, Excel and PowerPoint kind of sit in there, but also it's really useful if you've got an understanding of that organization's procurement system, the kind of the ordering system, things like the HR system for making sure expenses and everything are submitted. Now, you have to think about if you kind of go to a new company to be a PMO administrator, there's not necessarily the expectation that you would immediately know all of their systems, because that would be something any new person would have to be introduced to. But in order to do your role as a PMO administrator, those are the things that you would have to kind of get up to speed on to become effective. The second area of knowledge is to understand the boundaries of your authority and responsibilities. There's always an interesting one, isn't there, in terms of kind of, even though you're there to kind of chase certain bits of information, you don't necessarily have the authority to create any sanctions should people not be doing their part of the bargain. So we're understanding your roles, and we'll come on to kind of understanding the kind of the other roles as well, which is part of the PMO administrator role. So the third element there is having an understanding of how projects are delivered in your organization. Now, again, at an entry level, when you go into that, you won't necessarily understand all of the aspects of what's included in delivering projects. What is really useful is you have a general understanding of how projects work, the fact that projects are delivered to a life cycle, the fact that there are specific activities that take place during the project. And you'll see there I've kind of filled that with a whole load of acronyms that, again, as a project administrator, you were not expected to know as you kind of go into that role, but as you develop in that role and become more effective in that role, you recognize that there are different ways to deliver projects, and you have an understanding of the methods that you use on the project that you're working within. Fourth one on the top right, again, important in any role in an organization, just a general understanding of the language, the terminology, the culture that exists in the organization. And this is always kind of really interesting when, if we're talking about certain meetings and kind of how people interact and how communication happens in the organization, you know whether people prefer to have kind of emails, or whether they prefer to have meetings, or whether they prefer to have workshops, whether that's done in a very kind of formal structured way, or whether we work in a more informal way. So those are things, again, if you're new to the organization, you need to learn. But in order to be effective in your role of a PMO administrator, you need to understand the norms of the organization that you're working in. At the bottom left there, what we're then talking about is the standard corporate processes and procedures and any timings associated with that. So potentially, if you've got to get some papers from the project to the board meeting, understanding that the board meeting has, you know, kind of the minutes and the pre-reading gets sent out 5 days before the board meeting takes place is very useful to know. So rather than you kind of turn up a day beforehand and say, this is the, you know, this is the report for the meeting, for somebody to say, well, actually, they should have been received 5 days before, so we can circulate those out. Knowing what days purchase orders need to be signed off to be paid for is also really helpful. The one in the middle bottom there, actually understanding the organization's governance structure. Now, this is interesting when you work in business as usual, not in the project domain. Understanding who does what role is really quite important, so you know who to go to for what, which is where the kind of the next bit of knowledge comes in. But when you're working on a project and program, potentially the people who are working on that project or program have two jobs. They have their kind of their business as usual job, but they also have the role that they're playing in the project. So you have to be able to understand what their responsibilities are for the project, as well as what they are in the day job. So for example, we may have somebody working on the project who's an IT business analyst, systems analyst, but on the project they were part of the project team and they report into one of the project team leaders. In their day job, they report into an IT manager. So recognizing those different organization structures and how they work together becomes an important part of your role as well. And certainly kind of who to contact for what is where you start adding some real value to the project. So just kind of going back, just taking an example of this in terms of looking at kind of how that might, we use that on a day-to-day basis. If I'm going to have to understand the tools of the organization in order to be able to pull off the utilization report, but also to check the purchase orders. So there's some kind of just simple examples of how we would use that particular knowledge. Let's go forward, not backwards. When it comes to the organisation structure and governance, again, sorting out the room bookings and for the steering committee, understanding who's on that steering committee, where they sit in the organisation, how to get information to them becomes important. But also in terms of things like the technical spec for the project, there will be a kind of a set of responsibilities. So understanding kind of where that needs to go to from a project perspective becomes important. And also again then for the status update meeting, we also need to understand who gets to know all of the project information, because it may not necessarily be anybody and everybody. It may be a limited number of people in relation to the particular project we're working on. So quick look at the skills. Now you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to read every single skill that's on there. I think the knowledge was quite an important one to go through because a lot of that is transferable. When you look at these skills, I would suggest that none of these skills are actually project specific. The skills that we've highlighted in red, which are those kind of are going to be of particular use to the PMO administrator, are skills that you can develop before, or you can develop in any role, but then they're going to be used specifically when you come into the PMO administrator role. And again, we can have a look at kind of some of the challenges we have in terms of doing the role, in terms of kind of being able to balance competing needs and our own personal time management, about how do we get through all of this kind of agenda of work we need to do during the day. Plus, we've got this kind of potential stream of questions. So we really need to, as a PMO administrator, we need to be quite organized. We need to recognize the various levels of individuals who are working in and around the project to make sure we allocate our time off accordingly. So very much a generic skill, but used within a project context. Now, one of the things that we identified, not just through kind of the development of the competency framework, but through several years of working in a PMO and in and around projects, is that behaviours are absolutely key to effective delivery of your role. So, you know, some of the challenges that we have in being a PMO administrator is that kind of constant chasing around actions and getting people to fill in their timesheets on a weekly basis. And I'm not going to pretend that that's everybody's favorite job or necessarily the most enjoyable part of the role, but it is very often a role of a PMO administrator to go around and do that. Now, if we don't do that using the right behaviours, it's very easily to annoy individuals and to be seen to be that person who they avoid coming. So being able to demonstrate the right behaviours and being able to do that in such a way that you can influence people to do that, but actually you can kind of do that and help so they start doing that without you having to chase them on a regular basis. So that's not necessarily about kind of knowledge. There is some skills in there, but it really is about kind of how you do that. So that's just kind of one example in terms of kind of how you demonstrate some behaviours. And it really is about recognizing your limits of your expertise. And we would say, you know, an important thing as a PMO administrator is continuing to learn around the projects and the way the projects are being delivered. One of the great things about working in and around projects is all the projects that we work on tend to be very different. So there's always the opportunity to learn new ways of doing things and working with new groups of individuals. So we're constantly learning, even if we stay in the PMO administrator role, or we could, as we're going to come on to, look at what happens in the next stages of our career as we continue to learn and develop our skills and knowledge. So in terms of developing as a PMO administrator, the House of PMO have developed a range of certification courses that are aimed specifically at individuals who are moving into a role. So the House of PMO Essentials for PMO Administrators gives us all of that initial knowledge and skills and expertise to actually kind of help us as we start off in the role of a PMO administrator. So it's specifically aimed at people who have an interest in working in the project management arena, but potentially have got no knowledge or no experience in that world. People who want to, who've just started in the role of PMO administrator and just want to make sure they've kind of got all of their different areas covered off, or people who are looking to move into the role of the PMO administrator and perhaps think they need a bit more knowledge around the project areas before they take that role. And we do recognise that, unlike me, where people who end up in a PMO and never want to leave a PMO, that actually that the PMO is a great way as a very first step to becoming a project manager further down your career. So that's who the certification is aimed at. And it is based on the PMO competency framework that's been developed by the House of PMO, and we focus on two particular areas. We focus on P3M administration, which is the competence all around being that administrative support. But we do recognise that as a P3M, a PMO administrator, we will start doing some project program portfolio management support. So again, we will pick up on some of these areas in the bottom left-hand side here as an introduction to project management. So on the course, we'll cover off and we'll take information from the PMO competency framework. We take some information from the PMO service catalogue. So this is a text that tells us all of the types of things a PMO might actually do. And we also use a third text, which is the praxis framework. So the praxis framework is also an online resource that says how we deliver projects, programs, and portfolios. So essentially, this is where we get our base knowledge around projects and programs. So the administration course covers off a whole range of these different texts. Now, you don't need, you'll be pleased to know, you don't need to buy these textbooks. Some of them are kind of quite weighty. The course materials through APMG have all of the information you need in order to gain that certification. We just wanted to show you where those kind of that base information came from. So the idea of the 3-day course is that by the end of it, the candidates, the people who sit through that, will have an understanding of the role of the PMO administrator. They'll understand kind of where the PMO administrator works, so obviously in projects and programs, but actually that they understand specifically what projects, programs and portfolios are, what the PMOs do for those, and understand the 4 key roles within a PMO. So we're talking today about the PMO administrator. The course will also introduce you to the role of the PMO analyst, the PMO manager, and the PMO director. And then it will go into more detail around the specific competences that you need to successfully undertake the role of the PMO administrator. Now, it is worth saying as we go through the course, there's no way we can cover off in 3 days everything you might possibly need in order to kind of be the best PMO administrator that's out there. This is really to say this is the essential things you need to start as day one on your role as a PMO administrator. So it really is kind of covers off all of those kind of entry-level bases. So in terms of the, from a project management perspective, we've identified kind of 6 competencies, 6 areas where you're very likely to be involved and get involved in not just the kind of the standard administration around expenses, etc., but specific project management processes and documentation. And you might recognize some of these from some of the things we talked about in terms of the role of the PMO administrator. So we cover off change control. So this is all about making sure we understand what the project is there to deliver, making sure we understand what's involved in the kind of the overall scope of the project, but also the budget, and making sure that as things move and change, we keep everything up to date. So change control is a key area where we will provide some support. Second area we look after is information management. So we already mentioned about all of the information and documentation that we might be involved in. And again, when it comes to information management, it's really important that we understand the key documentation that is used around the management and control of the project. So we'll start introducing things like the project management plan, the project management schedule, change request forms. So there's a whole range of specific documentation that unless you've worked on projects and programs, you may not necessarily be aware of. So in this part of the course, we introduce you to a lot of the documents that will be involved on the project. We also spend some time talking about issue management. So again, on a project, part of one of the registers that we will potentially look after is all of the things that are potentially, all of the things that are causing the project grief at the moment, and there'll be a range of actions we need to continue to chase to make sure that those issues are being dealt with on a frequent basis. Reporting is, and it doesn't matter what role you do in a PMO, whether you be the PMO administrator, the PMO director, every role within the PMO at some point gets involved with some kind of reporting. And again, that could be around some of the standard administration work, or it could be reporting against the time spent on the project, how much activity is left to do this week, you know, kind of when the resources are rolling off. So again, specific to the project itself. We also do risk management. So again, all of those things that we're concerned about, all of those levels of uncertainty of things that might go wrong on the project, how are we making sure that we're looking forward to mitigate those risks? So again, we're not necessarily accountable for the whole of risk management on the project. That absolutely sits with the project manager, but we will support them by looking after the risk register, making sure that's kept up to date, making sure that's kind of circulated, stored in the right place in the document repository. And then final area we look at is financial management. And again, typically we would have a visibility of the project budget. We would update what's been spent, looking at working with the project manager and some of the project team to reforecast what's going to be spent going forward. So very much kind of sitting there behind the project manager and the team, pulling all of those numbers together. And again, it's always interesting in terms of people have, as they develop in their PMO career, some of them have specific specialisms. And I know one of the areas when I look back in terms of how I came into the PMO, mine was about resource management and financial management, because I came into the PMO when I was starting to forecast the cost of resources on projects. That's how I actually got into the PMO in the first place, and as I say, never came back. So that's the an important area that the PMO administrator would often get involved in. So kind of 6 key areas. In the competency framework, we do kind of register 26 different competencies, but we say as a PMO administrator, these are the 6 that you are most likely to get involved in as your first role as a PMO administrator. So what opportunities does it lay open for me if I kind of take this first step as a PMO administrator? Now, as Mark said right back at the very beginning, not every role you see advertised will be a PMO administrator. Sometimes it's called a project officer, sometimes it's a project support officer, sometimes it's even called a PMO coordinator, which sometimes in some organizations that's a step up, sometimes that potentially is the entry level. But sometimes when we're a PMO coordinator, that means we're working on kind of more complex or bigger projects and programs, or very often actually working across multiple projects. So rather than being allocated to a single individual project, you've got 2 or 3 that you're involved with. Also, a PMO coordinator might be somebody who specializes in one particular aspect of coordination. So as I said, I kind of did resource management and finance. There are other PMO specialist PMO coordinators who do specifically around the planning. There are some more and more now PMO coordinators who specialize in the overall reporting and some of the tools that are used to do that reporting. So we may become specialized or advanced in certain areas, and some people may even have spotted the spelling mistake, which I've just spotted, even though I ran a spell check, so that's an interesting one. So you may even become specialist in spelling. And the other thing you might do is you actually may become a lead for other PMO administrators. So if you work in an organization where you do projects on behalf of your clients, you may be the PMO coordinator who looks after the administrators who are working on those client projects. The natural next step up is typically into a PMO analyst role. So this is definitely where you're working on kind of more complex projects, and you're actually probably doing more work with the project team and actually doing some of the responsibilities for some project management activity. So as the administrator role, we're supporting projects and program managers in them doing the activities. But for example, as a PMO analyst, rather than kind of sitting there and just recording the information on the risk register. As a PMO analyst, I may actually be facilitating a risk workshop, because as a PMO analyst who's perhaps specialised in risk management, I can actually kind of run that workshop. I understand what needs to be achieved from that workshop, and I may have an administrator who's helped me do the documentation, or actually I may be doing both of those things. And again, I may actually, if I've specialised specifically, we've got there the Centre of Excellence work. So this is where actually, because I know enough about risk management, I'm starting to write the processes and procedures that the project is going to follow around risk management, or maybe introducing a tool on how the organisation is going to do risk management in a particular kind of system. So you can see kind of as we kind of move up through the kind of the PMO administrator role into the PMO analyst, we're starting to do more project management activity on behalf of the project manager. And then essentially our next role could actually be the assistant project manager. So this is where we either get a small project to work on our own, or a small part of a project where we're seen to be accountable for delivering that part of the project. So, you know, as you can see, you can kind of supporting to doing on behalf of the project manager, to actually being given a small bit of a project to actually do yourself is a natural progression from a PMO administrator. You'll often see on a very large project, no single project manager can actually do all of the project management work that needs to be done. So you'll have a kind of a senior project manager who will have a number of assistant project managers. So they'll be kind of split across a number of individuals. So that's where we would potentially see you moving to if you wanted to go into project management. Now, we don't necessarily have a slide for it, but you know, after a PMO analyst, if you wanted to stay within the PMO perspective, then the role of the PMO manager might be where you want to go instead. So, you know, kind of going into project management or kind of sticking within PMO would potentially be open to you as a role. So just to kind of recap in terms of actually becoming a PMO administrator. So I think I'm okay to finish a 1:45, and then we've got some 15 minutes or so for questions. To become a PMO administrator, we think it's really useful to gain that essential knowledge and understanding of what's involved in the PMO administrator. So you can go to the House of PMO website, you can have a look at the role description of the PMO administrator, and attending the Essentials for PMO Administrator course will give you the kind of the bullet points we've got listed here. You need to be able to understand a greater understanding of projects, programs and portfolios, and be able to kind of articulate who those roles are and recognize the role of the PMO administrator and how it sits with those other roles. Take some time to learn some of those essential competencies. So the competency framework, which is available from the House of PMO, you can actually kind of go in and make sure you can do an assessment, and just kind of, it has the tick list in there in terms of things that you need to be able to know and understand in relation to the PMO administrator role. And you could go and have a look around the PMOs that are currently in your organization to get an understanding about what they are actually doing and what the role of the PMO does in your specific organization. So obviously the competence framework that's been developed by the House of PMO is a generic description based on, there was a global piece of work for 3 years in order to pull that all together, but there will be some specific things in your organization about how those PMO administrators work. And then obviously, in terms of hopefully when you become that PMO administrator, you can continue your professional and personal development by actually kind of on the job training, by actually kind of doing that role. And you still learn an awful lot about doing your role on a day-to-day basis. And as we've said, based on the kind of the day's activities, typical day's activities of a PMO administrator, you will get the opportunity to continue to learn how projects are being delivered in your organization, and how the project manager works along with, again, different PMO roles and the systems and processes that sit behind that. So lots of opportunity to continue to learn and develop. So One of the things I always find quite interesting when we're doing a webinar is actually all I can hear is my own voice. So it'll be nice if Mark comes on back and says to me, have we had any questions as we've gone through the presentation, Mark?
Yeah, just one for now, but
Okay.
I suspect a few more will come in now that we've got to this point. So the question that we do have is around the entry level requirements for the role, and if you're someone that's sort of working in a different industry, organisation or function, but interested in the PMO side, what's your best first step in terms of who you speak to or what you look at in terms of to understand the role?
So I think there's a couple of things there. So if you're interested in the PMO administrator role, well, hopefully today has been of some help to you. And talking to somebody at the House of PMO perhaps can do that in a little bit more detail. And I'd be wrong to say actually going on the course is really quite helpful. If it's actually in your organisation, then actually have a look for some of the projects that are taking place in your organization. So depending on where you sit, IT will always have a range of projects going on. Typically the organization you will have as part of the briefings in your organization, you will be hearing about the changes that are happening. So whether that be a reorganization, whether that be introducing new ways of working, there will always be projects around your organization. So go and have a conversation with people who are working on that project and ask for a little bit more information on what's involved in the project. What is there a PMO administrator or a PMO support role on that project, and then go and have a conversation about what do they actually do on a day-to-day basis, and you'll start to get a feel about what that PMO administrator role is in your organization. If you want to get yourself ready for doing the role and you don't necessarily want to speak to somebody in your organization specifically, then there's a couple of other things that you can perhaps do. The PMO competency framework allows you to do a self-assessment against the knowledge, skills and behaviours that you would need in order to be a PMO administrator. So again, we're not expecting you to kind of know everything on day one, but it will certainly help you do a self-assessment in terms of kind of, well, what do I already know doing the job that I currently know that is transferable into the PMO administrator role. And then I think the other thing, as well as kind of webinars like you've been on today, the House of PMO and APMG offer a whole range of other webinars and events that you can go to meet other people who are very similar to yourself, who are looking to go into the administrator role, or will also have people there who've been in PMOs for a long time or a short time. So you'll be able to meet administrators, analysts and managers and have a conversation about potential career paths, how they got into that role as well. So look out for all of those events that there's many of them actually are free other than just your time.
Great, thanks Eileen. This is an interesting one. Is the project administrator role still relevant in the agile world of projects? And if it is, how do we stay relevant as PMO admin in an agile world?
So interesting one in terms of the I don't want to get into the whole kind of concept of agile, big A, little a. There is still in an agile world, there is still a requirement for roll-up reporting and information across all of the projects and programs in the organization. And there is still the requirement for the administration to help those projects continue to be able to kind of function as they do. So I think the role will always be there. In an agile project, there may be, as we've talked about, there are many different ways to deliver a project, and there may be a slightly different way of doing risk management. There might be kind of slightly different tools and techniques that you use, but the role of the PMO administrator will still be there.
Great, thank you. And these two questions are sort of similar, so I'll cover them both. Is there a significant difference between a project administrator and a PMO administrator? And what's the difference between a project coordinator and PMO admin?
So I think this is where we get kind of caught up in the fact that lots of different organizations use the same term, use different terms for the same thing. So there are lots of different terms that we can use for the PMO administrator role. So the PMO coordinator, I've said, sometimes in organizations it's a more senior PMO administrator. In some organizations it's exactly the same thing. And the project administrator is the same as a PMO administrator, is the same as a program administrator. So what we did when we pulled together the competency framework and we came up with the term PMO administrator, it was the most common term for the entry-level role working in a PMO supporting projects, programs and portfolios. So one of the things that kind of the House of PMO are trying to do is getting some recognised standard terminology so people actually understand the level of the role that they're actually applying for, because at the minute where we're using all of these kind of different terms, sometimes it'd be quite difficult to see kind of what level of role I'm actually applying for. So we've got certainly having run some of the courses when we do a role, and I've done this for a PMO administrators course when we've been delivering this. We've had people on there who are essentially a PMO administrator and a PMO analyst, and are actually doing some of the job of a PMO manager as well, because they are the only person in that organisation who's doing PMO. So I can't give you a kind of a perfect answer because the world is not yet perfect, and that there's too many terms used for the same thing, or lots of terms, not necessarily too many, but a lot of terms used for the same role.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. I think you could probably insert the name of any other method or framework here, but somebody's specifically asked, is Prince2 essential for PMO roles?
We would say not for the PMO administrator. So from a PMO administrator roles, it's recognizing what a project is and some of the generic characteristics of projects. And then as you kind of get yourself established in the role, and again, it depends, if you go to an organization and they use Prince2, understanding more about Prince2 will be helpful. But if you go into another organization who uses SAFE, for example, another methodology, then having an understanding of SAFE is going to be more helpful. But from an entry-level perspective, it's really understanding the generic characteristics of projects and programs that is actually going to get you through the door.
Great, perfect. Somebody's asked for a link to the PMO competency framework, so I'll make sure that's we'll feature that in the follow-up email.
Thanks, Mark.
Out for that.
I also think it's probably worth giving people the link to Praxis framework, because that, you know, if you want to go and start getting an understanding of projects, the Praxis framework is a great way of doing that, and you've got free access to that.
Yeah, we can do that, of course. So next question, do you think someone who has been in an operational role and has moved to PMO with no background training would benefit from the course despite the transferable skills already in place?
I think so, and we've had lots of people who've been on the course who've actually been in the administrator role, have just got a much broader idea about what's involved in a PMO administrator. One of the other things that we find is that the administrator role is not necessarily identical in other organisations or even in different parts of the same organisation. So going on the course will allow you to meet other people who are doing the PMO administrator role and see where there are potentially opportunities to develop that in your current situation you're perhaps not getting experience of.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. How do you deal with the aspect of misunderstanding? So PMO could mean project management office, program management office, portfolio management, and each of those obviously has a different focus, different perspective.
Yes, and that is something we cover off on the course to give new administrators the difference between projects, programs and portfolios. And when it comes to the competency framework, we recognise that just because I understand risk in a project situation doesn't mean I understand risk in a program situation. So during the course, we will take you through the risk management and understand and talk through what that might mean at project, program and portfolio level.
Okay, this easy one for me actually. Is the course accredited? Yes. So yeah, I mean,
you get a lovely badge.
Yeah, so Eileen and the team at House PMO sort of develop the course, but we accredit it and we accredit the training providers that offer it. There's an element of this question that I'm not familiar with. Is it accredited by RICS? I'm not sure what that is.
That's RICS, that's the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, is my guess. I'm assuming that's what they're asking for. None of the project management courses are specifically accredited by some of the other professional bodies, though they recognise them. So it is a APMG, or a well-established accreditation body, which so RICS will recognise them as an accreditation body, and even though they may not necessarily be aware of this specific certification, I'm sure they will be prepared to recognise it because it's part of APMG's certification suite. It's one of the reasons why the House of PMO actually partnered with APMG, was because of their kind of credibility and experience in doing accreditations.
Okay, and just one final question. It's quite a broad question, I think. How do you share best practices within a team? I suppose there's quite a lot of ways, I guess, aren't there?
And again, one of the things that often the PMO is involved in is being able to actually to have events. So we talked about, didn't we, in the presentation, about having a lunch and learn session that the PMO administrator was going to, and very often it's the PMO who's involved in providing opportunities. So again, several times I've run kind of monthly sessions with the project management community and ran the community of practice, and created kind of shared portals where we can share that information. I definitely saw part of what we do at the House of PMO is we have a membership, and part of being a member gives you access to a whole range of information and forums where you can meet and talk with other people who are interested in and around PMO subject areas.
Perfect. That takes us to the end, so we'll start the wrap up there, and got a few minutes left as well, so great time in there, Eileen. So yeah, a couple of other slides on the screen for you as well. So this is just highlighting the suite that Eileen's already referenced earlier in the session. So you've got the two certifications in the bottom left that are available now for analysts and administrators that we've been talking about today. And then we've got the managers and directors levels coming soon later in the year. So you've got the web address up there, the APMG International /PMO.
Sorry, I've gone straight forward into the House of PMO.
Yeah, no problem. And that's where you can find out all about the House of PMO. That's where the competency framework lives as well. But as I say, we'll make sure the links are in the follow-up emails, so do look out for that over the next couple of days. And just a few final links there. So I think that takes us to the close. So thank you. Yeah, thank you very much everyone for attending. I hope you found it interesting, useful, informative. And thank you, Eileen, so much for your insights and expertise today. Really good session. Yeah, look out for the final email, and just thanks again everyone for joining us. Enjoy the weekend ahead.
Thank you very much. Good to see you all.
Bye bye.